Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a number that shot up by 145%.
Wow.
Yeah. That single surge, it didn't just stay on a spreadsheet. It fundamentally altered, the cost of everything from your phone to your groceries. And here's the kicker. Understanding why that number jumped can give you a real handle on these powerful economic forces shaping our world. Plus, maybe even sharpen your English along the way.
What's immediately striking there is just the magnitude, right? 145% tax on imported goods isn't like a subtle nudge.
Yeah.
It's a massive price hike.
Right.
It has the potential to send ripples across entire economies and, well, right into your household budget.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, welcome to this deep dive. And forget those dry economic lectures. We're plunging into a relatable, sort of real-world situation. We're calling it the Great Tariff Tale.
Okay.
It's set in this fictional town, Tradewinds. But think of it as decoding global economics through the stories of, well, your neighbors. Because what happened in Tradewinds really echoes what so many American communities experienced.
And that localized perspective is absolutely key, I think. These aren't abstract concepts just floating out there.
Right.
They are policies with very real consequences for businesses, big and small, the job market, and, ultimately the prices you see every time you go shopping. Grasping these mechanisms equips you to better understand the economic news and the ongoing debates around international trade.
And you'll meet folks like Mike, the owner of the local cafe. He's always got his ear to the ground. Sarah, a business owner who really felt the direct squeeze. And George, a retiree who saw, well, a surprising return to the past because of these tariffs. Their stories aren't just anecdotes, they're the human side of these big economic shifts.
In these individual narratives, they're invaluable for making abstract concepts concrete. Reading about a tariff is one thing. Hearing how it impacted someone's ability to run their business, or even just afford everyday stuff, makes the issue much more tangible, easier to grasp.
So, have you ever found yourself feeling a bit lost when conversations turn to, say, economics or politics in English? Or maybe international news feels like it's in a whole other language sometimes?
Yeah, it can feel that way.
Our mission today is really to bridge that gap for you. We want to provide you with the understanding and, the vocabulary to navigate these important discussions with confidence.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the ability to discuss these economic and political issues, especially in our interconnected world, it's becoming essential.
Totally.
Whether you're just following current events or participating in discussions, or maybe even operating in the business world, having a solid understanding of these concepts and the words for them, it's a significant advantage.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. It's a bright Monday morning, April 2025. And the big news has just dropped across the nation.
Right.
The president has announced a significant reduction in tariffs on goods coming from China, down from that eye-watering 145%.
Oof.
Now, this wasn't completely out of left field. Treasury Secretary Besant had been dropping some hints about a possible, de-escalation of the trade situation with China.
That context, the potential de-escalation, it suggests that maybe those initial high tariffs were intended as more of a temporary tactic, like a lever in negotiations. So this reduction could signal a change in strategy, or maybe a response to the economic effects they were seeing from keeping those tariffs so high.
Exactly. Now, Tradewinds, this town we're using as our focal point, it really acts like a miniature version of the broader American economy.
Okay.
It has businesses that sell their goods overseas and others that rely on bringing in goods from other countries. So when international trade rules change, well, Tradewinds feels it directly. It's a good place to see how it all plays out, on a local level.
Yeah, focusing on a single community like that, one with both export businesses and import-reliant ones. We can really see how these broad policies create ripples throughout different parts of the economy and impact individuals in very specific, very relatable ways.
So the natural gathering spot in Tradewinds to chew over the morning's news is Mike Peterson's Sunrise Cafe.
Of course.
Mike doesn't just serve coffee. He actually used to work in a factory in town before it faced cutbacks. So he's got a real personal interest in what this tariff news means for Tradewinds.
And that background gives him a valuable kind of dual perspective, doesn't it? He's got that firsthand experience in manufacturing.
Right.
But now, as a small business owner, he's also directly tied to, consumer spending and the cost of the goods he needs for the cafe. He's perfectly positioned to observe the town's reaction.
And who walks into the cafe but George Wilson, a retired steelworker? George lived through the impact of import competition on his industry. He vividly remembers when those 145% tariffs hit.
Oh, I bet.
He said the prices at Tradewinds Hardware nearly doubled, like overnight. The owner, Jim, he had no choice but to jack up prices, and people just stopped buying, which led to reduced hours and eventually layoffs, a real chain reaction.
Wow. George's memory there. It powerfully illustrates that immediate, sharp impact tariffs can have on consumer prices, on the fortunes of local businesses. A near doubling of prices, that would have just tanked affordability.
For sure.
And likely led to a big downturn in sales, with all those knock-on effects for jobs.
Then you've got Sarah Chen. She's an accountant, and her brother runs an electronics store in town. He's been struggling because the cost of components he sources from overseas just skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to compete with the big online guys became a real uphill battle.
Yeah, Sarah's brother's experience highlights how tariffs can hit businesses deep in those global supply chains particularly hard.
Right.
Even if a product isn't entirely imported, tariffs on essential components can severely disadvantage smaller businesses trying to compete with, the Amazons of the world.
Right. And just then, Lisa Johnson, she's the high school economics teacher, she comes in and she poses the big question on everyone's mind. Did those super high tariffs actually achieve what they were supposed to? Protect American jobs. It's the central debate, really.
Lisa's question gets right to the core of the whole economic debate around tariffs. The stated intention is often, yes, to safeguard domestic jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But the real-world outcomes, they can be much more complex, often involve significant unintended consequences.
So let's just get clear on the basics for a second. Tariffs are basically taxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Applied to goods when they cross a border, in this case, goods imported into the U.S.
Yep.
That 145% tariff meant an American business bringing in stuff from China had to pay an additional 145% of the value of those goods to the government.
Right.
And who do you think ultimately pays that extra cost? More often than not, it's passed on to you, the consumer, higher prices.
It's fundamental to grasp that direct link, that transmission mechanism from the tariff to the price you pay. Businesses pay the tax initially, sure, but those costs, they frequently get factored right into their pricing, making a whole range of everyday goods more expensive.
Now, the official justification, the story they told, was that these tariffs were designed to make American-made products more competitive, to level the playing field for our domestic industries, support American manufacturers. The idea was, encourage everyone to buy American.
And, in theory, that rationale holds some weight. By making imported goods more expensive, domestic alternatives should become relatively more attractive, price-wise.
Should.
But the actual success of that strategy, it hinges on a lot of things, like, are there comparable domestic goods available?
Yeah.
How sensitive are consumers to price changes? And crucially, the potential for other countries to hit back with their own tariffs. retaliation.
But as we're seeing unfold in Tradewinds, the reality, it turned out to be far more intricate. Take George's cousin, for example.
Okay.
He's now working at a television factory that reopened in Westville. It had been closed for a decade.
Wow.
But thanks, in part anyway, to the tariffs, it's now employing 300 people. And those TVs proudly say, "Made in America." That sounds like a clear win, doesn't it?
On the surface, absolutely. The reopening of a factory, 300 manufacturing jobs, created that certainly appears to be a positive result. That's often the most visible, most politically appealing outcome you see with protective tariffs. That revitalization of domestic production.
But then you have Sarah's friend Maria. She owned a small business importing handcrafted furniture. Those tariffs nearly put her out of business. She had to lay off 12 people, warehousing, customer service, everything.
Ouch.
So, while some factory jobs might have returned, jobs in businesses that relied on imports were just disappearing. It's a real balancing act. Not everyone comes out ahead.
Marie's experience perfectly highlights those inherent trade-offs in tariff policies.
Right.
Certain sectors might benefit from less import competition, sure.
Right.
But others that rely on imported goods, they face increased costs, maybe lower demand, leading to job losses there. The overall impact on the labor market is a really key thing to consider.
So it's a real push and pull. Some bits of the economy benefit, others get hurt. Now, let's focus on Tradewinds Electronics for a minute. Run by the brothers Jason and David Shen. They assemble circuit boards. They use a mix of components, some sourced here, some internationally. The last few years, with these unpredictable tariff changes, disruptions to their supply chains, it's been incredibly challenging for them.
Yeah, businesses like Tradewinds Electronics operating within those complex, interconnected global supply chains, they're particularly vulnerable to swings in tariff policy.
Makes sense.
They rely on this whole network of international suppliers, and sudden cost increases on essential components that can significantly mess with their production, their bottom line.
Exactly. Jason was actually saying he hoped that even a partial reduction, maybe down to 70%, could be a real turning point for them. He thinks they might finally be able to afford to rehire some staff they had to let go. Because the cost of crucial components, like capacitors from Shenzhen, had just become prohibitively expensive under that 145% tariff. It really shows how these tariffs have this cascading effect through the whole interconnected global economy.
And the fact that even a partial drop down to 70% could trigger rehiring decisions, that just underscores the substantial burden the 145% tariff placed on their operating costs.
Yeah.
It also demonstrates how sensitive jobs are within these globally integrated businesses to changes in trade policy.
And to give us a wider view, we need to bring in some expertise. Let's consider the perspective of Dr. Emily Richardson. She's a trade economist.
Yeah.
She describes tariffs as somewhat clumsy tools. Blunt instruments, I think she called them.
That's a common and, I think, apt description among economists.
Yeah. They don't just affect the specific goods they target, she says. They can send ripples throughout the entire economic system.
Exactly. It reflects that idea that tariffs aren't these precisely targeted scalpels. They can generate widespread, often unintended consequences across many different sectors.
He pointed out that after the 145% tariff went up, we saw price increases on everyday items like washing machines, solar panels, aluminum, pretty much anything with electronic components. And it wasn't just companies directly importing finished goods from China. It also hit American businesses that used those imported materials in their own production, like construction companies or those tech startups.
Those examples Dr. Richardson gives really illustrate the interconnectedness of modern economies, don't they?
Yeah.
Tariffs on intermediate goods like aluminum or electronic parts lead to higher costs for businesses using those inputs.
Right.
Which ultimately translates to higher prices for consumers across a whole diverse range of industries.
And she confirmed what we saw anecdotally in Tradewinds. Yes, some manufacturing jobs did come back. But we also saw job losses in businesses that depended on imports or in American companies that export their goods and then faced retaliatory tariffs from China.
Right.
It's a much more complex picture than a simple America First narrative might suggest.
Dr. Richardson's analysis really reinforces that nuanced reality of trade policy.
Yeah.
The idea that tariffs just provide this straightforward benefit to all domestic industries. That's often a big oversimplification.
Yeah. Retaliatory tariffs can significantly harm export businesses, and higher costs for imported inputs can hurt domestic manufacturers who rely on them.
Back in Tradewinds, Lisa's economics class had a very timely discussion about international trade.
Good timing.
She made sure her students understood the difference between protective tariffs, aiming to shield domestic industries, and retaliatory tariffs, which are essentially, economic countermeasures, punishing countries for perceived unfair trade practices.
That's a crucial foundation. Understanding the different types and their intended purposes is key to analyzing the effects.
And she highlighted a key historical shift.
Right.
While way back, tariffs were a big source of government revenue.
Right.
Today, their main purpose is typically protection for domestic industries, or, like we said, retaliation in trade disputes. It's less about government income these days.
That historical context is important. While they did historically fund governments, their modern use is largely focused on influencing trade patterns, protecting producers, though they still do generate some revenue, of course. Now, let's think about how these big policy decisions filter down to everyday families. Consider the Martinez family.
Okay.
Carlos runs a small construction business. He's really felt the squeeze from higher material costs. His wife, Elena, manages a department store downtown.
The Martinez family gives us that relatable microcosm, doesn't it? How trade policies impact different sectors and individual households. Carlos's construction business hit by material prices.
Yeah.
Elena's department store sensitive to the cost and availability of all sorts of consumer goods, many imported.
Carlos had been thinking about bidding on a school renovation project. But with inflated prices for steel, aluminum, stuff like that, the numbers just didn't work. But if these tariffs see a significant drop, that project might actually become viable again.
Right.
Elena, meanwhile, she was hoping a tariff reduction would let her restock some popular imported items that had just gotten too expensive for her customers.
Carlos's potential project shows how lower material costs from reduced tariffs can stimulate activity, create jobs in related industries like construction.
Yep.
And Elena's hope reflects that potential for increased consumer choice and maybe lower prices.
And their daughter, Sophia, clearly paying attention in Lisa's class, asked a really smart question. What about American companies? How will this affect them?
Good question.
It sparked a good family discussion about the complexities. The potential for more competition from imports, but also maybe lower input costs for some American manufacturers. And ultimately, potential benefits for consumers through lower prices.
Sophia's question demonstrates a crucial part of economic literacy, understanding that trade policies have these multifaceted consequences.
Right.
There are often potential benefits and drawbacks for domestic companies, for consumers. The Martinez family's chat really highlights those real-world complexities at the household level.
So what was the thinking behind the government actually deciding to partially roll back these tariffs? Treasury Secretary Bessent explained it. He said the initial 145% tariffs were basically a tool to bring China to the negotiating table. But he acknowledged that keeping them that high for too long was creating negative consequences. especially driving up costs for American consumers and businesses.
Secretary Besson's explanation gives insight into that strategic use of tariffs as a negotiating tactic. But acknowledging the downsides of keeping them high for too long suggests they recognize the economic costs involved. Maybe a pivot towards a more balanced approach.
He suggested the reduction was aimed at still keeping pressure on China issues like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers.
Right, the core issues.
While at the same time providing some economic relief here at home. He was careful, though, not to give specific numbers yet, framed it as part of ongoing discussions.
And that lack of specifics underscores how sensitive these trade negotiations are. The reduction was likely a calculated move pursuing policy goals while trying to lessen the negative economic fallout. But the final details were still being worked out diplomatically.
Across the Pacific, officials in China responded with cautious optimism. They emphasized the value of continued dialogue, negotiation. It seemed like there might be a slight thaw in that previously pretty frosty economic relationship.
That cautiously optimistic tone from China suggests a mutual interest in de-escalating things. Their focus on dialogue lines up with the idea that negotiation is better than just prolonged conflict for resolving trade disputes.
So the news rippled through Tradewinds pretty quickly. The Sunrise Cafe saw even more people than usual, all wanting to talk about what it meant.
I bet.
Tom Murphy, he's a local truck driver, mentioned he'd noticed fewer shipping containers coming in from China lately. He hoped more trade would mean more work for dock workers and truckers like him.
Tom's observation is that tangible, real-world indicator, isn't it? Shows the impact on trade volumes and related industries like shipping, logistics. More trade activity would likely mean more demand for those services.
But George, ever the seasoned observer, he voiced his concern. What if cheaper imported goods start flooding back in? Could those factories that just reopened be forced to close again?
That's a valid concern. It reflects the potential vulnerability some of those newly revived domestic industries might feel facing renewed international competition.
Yeah.
The possibility of job losses in those sectors is still a significant factor to weigh when adjusting tariffs. It really highlighted the lack of easy answers and the genuine anxieties of people whose livelihoods are directly tied to all this.
Then Lisa's economics class had that special guest, Dr. Richardson.
Ah, yes.
She really emphasized just how complex and interconnected modern supply chains have become. She used the example of a smartphone.
Great example.
Pointing out its components often come from numerous countries all over the world.
Yeah, the smartphone example is powerful, easy to understand. Shows that intricate, globalized nature of how things are made today. It really demonstrates how tariffs on goods from one country can affect a whole network of businesses and consumers across the globe.
And that's when a lot of the pieces clicked into place for people realizing that hitting Chinese products with a tariff doesn't just affect companies in China. It impacts this vast web of production that often includes American companies, too. She clarified, though, that tariffs aren't inherently bad. They can be useful in specific situations, like temporary protection for new industries, leveling the playing field against unfair practices, or as a negotiation tool.
Sure.
But, she cautioned, if they're too broad or stay in place too long, they can cause a host of problems. Higher prices, retaliation, the supply chain disruptions we've been talking about.
Dr. Richardson provides that balanced, nuanced perspective, acknowledging their potential use in specific, well-defined cases, while underscoring the big risks if they're applied too widely or for too long. That nuanced understanding is crucial for navigating trade policy complexities.
Over at Tradewinds Electronics, the Chen brothers were on another conference call, this time with their supplier in Shenzhen.
Why?
They were talking about maybe significantly increasing their orders if the tariffs really were going to come down. Mr. Zhang, their supplier, he indicated he was willing to discuss better pricing if the tariff cuts happened. But understandably, he needed concrete details first. It just underscores that despite all the political tension, those underlying business relationships built on mutual benefit, they keep going.
Absolutely. Those ongoing commercial interactions between the Chens and Mr. Zhang really highlight that fundamental economic interdependence that just persists regardless of political friction. These relationships are often driven by efficiency, specialization, mutual profit.
Before long, reports started circulating with more specifics. It looked like tariffs on most goods from China would be reduced to around 60%.
Okay, getting more concrete.
The stock market reacted positively. Companies that had been hit hard saw their stock prices rise. In Tradewinds, you could feel this sort of cautious optimism starting to bubble up. Mayor Thompson even scheduled a town hall meeting to discuss what it all meant for the community.
That positive stock market response reflects investor confidence, right? Potential for lower trade tensions, better economic conditions for those affected companies. And the mayor's town hall, that's an important platform for the community to process and respond collectively to these big changes.
But even at the town hall, the diverse, sometimes conflicting concerns really came out. Jim from Tradewinds Hardware hoped to finally lower prices, rehire staff. But he also worried about the instability of trade policy. Just, would it last?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Maria, the import business owner, shared how she'd been forced to completely restructure, find suppliers elsewhere after nearly going bankrupt.
Oh, she adapted.
And a worker from that Westville TV factory. He voiced his unease about cheaper imported TVs coming back. It really showed the wide range of impacts, different perspectives. Mayor Thompson ended by emphasizing unity, resilience as Tradewinds navigated all this.
That range of perspectives at the town hall just underscores how unevenly the effects of trade policy changes are distributed across different sectors, different people, even in one town. The mayor's emphasis on unity and resilience highlights how important that social cohesion is when you're adapting to economic shifts.
Then came the official announcement. President Trump held a press conference, confirmed tariffs reduced from 145% down to 65%.
Okay, 65%. Still high, but a big drop.
He explained it was intended to give relief to American consumers and businesses, while still keeping some protection for domestic industries and pressure on China about those key issues.
Right.
He also mentioned commitments China had supposedly made and reiterated the U.S. would be watching closely to make sure they followed through. Reactions were varied. Some praised it as a reasonable compromise. Others criticized it not going far enough or going too far.
President Trump's announcement was trying to strike that balance, wasn't it? Relief for domestic stakeholders, but maintaining leverage with China. The diverse reactions reflect those different priorities and viewpoints on what the right level of tariff should be and the bigger strategic picture.
Back at the Sunrise Cafe, Sarah observed that even at 65%, that tariff rate was still significantly higher than before the trade war started.
That's true. Context matters.
Mike hoped for a more predictable, stable trade environment going forward. And George, true to form, just wished things would stay consistent for a while.
Yeah.
It really highlighted that critical need for policy predictability. Businesses need that to make informed decisions, plan for the future.
That desire for predictability is so common, so understandable among businesses. Frequent, big changes in tariffs create uncertainty. Makes it really tough to develop long-term investment strategies, operational plans.
Across different industries, businesses started reassessing. Retailers began recalculating prices. Manufacturers evaluated sourcing options. farmers considered the potential impact of a reduced Chinese retaliatory tariffs on their exports. Tradewinds Electronics started updating their business plan, looking at a more diversified sourcing approach.
A hybrid model.
Yeah, a mix of domestic and international suppliers.
Yeah.
Building in more flexibility, more resilience. There was this general sense of cautious optimism, but tempered by the lessons learned about relying too much on just one source.
That widespread reassessment shows the dynamic response of the economy, doesn't it? Businesses constantly adapt sourcing, pricing, based on the trade landscape, and the move towards more diversified supply chains. That definitely reflects a lesson learned about the risks of overconcentration.
Sure enough, China formally acknowledged the U.S. tariff cut and announced its own plans to reduce the retaliatory tariffs it had put on American goods.
Reciprocity.
This was particularly welcome news for American farmers, like Mark Johnson over in Greenfield soybeans. He'd essentially lost his biggest export market due to the
Huge relief for agriculture, yeah.
It clearly demonstrated the damaging impact of those retaliatory tariffs on specific American industries.
That reciprocal reduction by China is a crucial step in de-escalating tensions. Provides significant relief to those American sectors, especially agriculture, that were directly harmed by retaliation.
As time passed, the effects of the lower tariffs started to materialize in Tradewinds. Prices at the shopping center saw a gradual decrease.
Gradual?
Yeah, not as dramatic as some had hoped, largely due to the complexities of unwinding supply chains,
Right, it takes time.
Elena at the department store, she was finally able to restock some of those previously too expensive imported items, though their prices were still somewhat higher than before the trade war started.
Lingering effects.
And Carlos noticed a slow but steady decline in the cost of building materials. It served as a reminder that the economy doesn't just snap back overnight. There are lasting consequences from years of trade tensions.
That gradual nature of the price drops reflects that inherent stickiness in supply chains. Businesses take time to adjust pricing fully, and the lingering higher prices suggest the full economic cost of the trade war might not be immediately erased. It's a new equilibrium, maybe.
Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a new round of trade talks started between the U.S. and China, focusing on those deeper issues: intellectual property, market access, subsidies.
Structural stuff.
Exactly. Dr. Richardson emphasized that just tweaking tariff rates isn't enough. You need sustained diplomatic effort to address those underlying structural issues. She reminded us that tariffs are just one tool in a much bigger kit.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with a complex relationship involving different economic systems, tech competition, security concerns, geopolitics, it's bigger than just tariffs.
Dr. Richardson's point really underscores that multidimensional nature of the U.S.-China economic relationship. Tariffs are visible, sure, but tackling the fundamental issues requires sustained dialogue across a whole spectrum of areas.
3 months later, Tradewinds held its annual summer festival. And there was this noticeably more optimistic, though still kind of cautious, atmosphere.
Okay, a mood shift.
Local businesses were highlighting slightly lower prices, new products. Tradewinds Electronics had a booth showcasing their rehired staff and their diversified sourcing strategy.
Good for them.
Maria was there too, displaying furniture sourced from a wider range of countries now. It was a tangible sign of business resilience, their ability to adapt. Mayor Thompson gave a speech emphasizing the community's ingenuity, determination.
The summer festival serves as that symbolic marker, doesn't it, of the community's recovery and adaptation. The resilience shown by local businesses adjusting their strategies, plus the mayor's remarks, highlights that community spirit in navigating economic challenges.
Back at their usual table in the Sunrise Cafe, the regulars were talking about a new sense of equilibrium. Not a return to how things were, but an adaptation to a new reality.
A new normal.
Mike observed that America seemed to have this knack for finding a middle ground eventually. George, still a bit skeptical, conceded that maybe 145% had been too extreme.
Even George.
And Lisa pointed out that ultimately, trade is about relationships, finding ways for everyone to benefit. There was this palpable sense the community had gained a deeper understanding of global economic interconnectedness.
Those reflections capture that subtle but significant shift in the community's understanding, moving away from maybe more simplistic views towards a more nuanced appreciation of interdependence. That's a key outcome of going through something like this.
And the crucial thing to remember is that the 65% tariff isn't the final chapter, right? It's just another point along this ongoing continuum of the U.S.-China trade relationship.
Absolutely. It's dynamic.
The key takeaway maybe is that international trade requires continuous adjustment, a willingness to find balance. Tradewinds, in the end, emerged with a more profound understanding of these global economic forces and the critical importance of adaptability in a changing world.
That continuing evolution of the U.S.-China relationship underscores the inherently dynamic nature of international economics. And the experience of Tradewinds really highlights that ongoing need for adaptability, for a long-term perspective when navigating these complexities.
As Mike locked up the cafe for the night, he was reflecting on how much he'd personally learned about trade policy. He realized those decisions made way off in Washington had very real direct consequences for his small business, his community. And he felt Tradewinds as a whole had gained a more nuanced, more grounded understanding of their place in the larger global economy.
Mike's concluding thoughts perfectly encapsulate that central theme, I think. International trade policy has tangible, significant effects on local communities. And understanding those effects is essential for navigating the intricacies of the global economic landscape.
And that brings us to the close of The Great Tariff Tale. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We sincerely hope this exploration has not only illuminated the complexities of international trade policies, but has also maybe enriched your English vocabulary and sharpened your listening comprehension.
Yet learning English through the context of compelling stories like this, it provides a valuable, engaging way to pick up new vocabulary and understand complex ideas. And the economic terms, the concepts we discussed today, they're highly relevant in global news, in business. It makes the knowledge really useful.
So take a moment now to maybe think about the new words or expressions you encountered. Which of the Tradewinds residents did you find most relatable? And what part of their story helped you connect with a new economic concept?
We really encourage you to reflect on your learning experience, identifying that new vocabulary, pinpointing the story elements that helped you understand that can significantly reinforce your learning. Helps you recall the information later.
And we'd love to hear from you. Please head over to the comments section, share any new vocabulary you picked up, or maybe which aspects of the story you found most helpful for your English learning journey.
Yeah, your feedback is incredibly valuable. It helps us tailor future content to better meet your needs. So please do share your insights in the comments.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Great Tariff Tale and found it helpful for improving your English, please give us a thumbs up. And maybe share it with anyone else who you think might benefit from it.
Your support really helps us reach a wider audience of learners. Sharing this can be a great way to help others on their English language learning path too.
And don't forget to subscribe to the show. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of our future deep dives. We have many more engaging stories and insightful explorations coming your way.
By subscribing, you'll stay informed about our latest episodes and make sure you continue your learning journey with us.
Join our growing community of curious minds and avid story listeners. We're dedicated to making learning both engaging and easily accessible to everyone.
We warmly welcome you to our community and really look forward to continuing to explore fascinating topics together.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring the world around you and keep on learning.
Thank you for joining us today. We eagerly anticipate our next exploration together.